Good evening, good afternoon, and good morning, wherever you are. We thank our audience for joining us from all over the world for this evening. The topic for discussion is From Brown to Progressive Shades of Green. Has the pandemic advanced the sustainability agenda? For the past 9 months, we have been consumed by one issue: how to handle the COVID pandemic, and rightly so. We have seen advanced industrialized countries with sophisticated health systems overwhelmed by the coronavirus, and less developed countries have seen staggering deaths and innumerable infections. The North or South, rich or poor, there have been too many deaths. At the same time, we experience extreme weather, climate-triggered disasters. Look at California and the wildfires, Oregon. In May and June, China experienced heavy, intense flooding and expansive flooding. And down south in Australia, bushfires raged. And for the Australians, it was the worst in living memory. So we have clearly two serious crises, profound crises, on our hands. Some people have said we should never let a crisis go to waste. This session will discuss how we can use this health crisis to focus on and further the very critical issue of sustainability of our planet, our existential crisis. But the politics of the moment has shifted from caring about long-term sustainability towards the immediate creation of jobs and restarting the economy. The Pew Research Center, in fact, just ran a survey recently, July, August, of the registered electors voters in the United States. And 42% of the registered voters who were surveyed said their vote would go to climate. Let me go over again and introduce our speakers. The first panelist is Mr. Vijay Advani, Executive Chairman of Noveen, the investment manager of TIAA. Our second panelist is Dr. Ma Jun, Chairman, Green Finance Committee of the China Society of Finance and Banking. He is also the director of the Center for Finance and Development at Tsinghua University. The third panelist is Mr. Feike Sejcema, who is the honorary chairman of the Royal DSM, a multinational active in health, nutrition, and materials. I will put the first question to Feike, as he is the Corona Envoy, Special Corona Envoy of the Netherlands. Feike, do you think that the health crisis, do you think that there will be great change in the way we live, work, and play after COVID? Will there be transformation? And the second part of the question is, will this pandemic health crisis be an opportunity for us to usher in a greater focus on the green agenda?
Yes, thank you, Professor Chan, and thank you for all the listeners to this important Singapore Summit, and sorry for the technical interruption. I do think it will change our lives. It started as a healthcare crisis, it resulted in an economic crisis and even a social crisis around the globe, not only in China, not only in Asia, which we saw to the beginning, but then in Italy, and then the entire Europe, and then also the US and Latin America. And now globally, we are impacted by the corona crisis. My biggest concern is that it impacts the inequality in the world, the inequality within countries, because people lose their job or lose their business or whatever, and the inequality between countries, and especially the most vulnerable countries who are already dealing with locusts in Africa or climate change, etc., now get the corona crisis also. So this corona crisis really asks for a balanced and inclusive response. And since we're going to spend trillions of dollars to recover from this corona crisis, I hope that a part of this money is being spent on building back better, and not that we get the great restart to an ancient point in history, January 2020, when everything so-called was okay, because that was not true either, but that we do not a great restart, but a great reset, and build back a better society in terms of circularity, in terms of sustainability, in terms of addressing climate change. And when we did not see this corona crisis coming, we cannot say that we did not see the climate crisis coming. So we need to work on what I call the Great Reset. And next to the inequality and the Great Reset, it will affect some businesses on the long term. I mean, hospitality or traveling will not be the same. Maybe real estate will not be exactly the same anymore. Maybe shopping will not be the same exactly anymore, or at least for a longer period in time. So business need to reshape itself and adjust. Society will work differently on distance, etc. Need to adjust. We need to prepare that we do not get another crisis called the climate crisis. On top of that, we need to address inequality. So a part of the money that we spend is not for the Great Restart, but for the Great Reset. And business, I think, is ready for contributing to that. Not alone, but together with NGOs, together with governments. And I think that is the major task in front of us, not only to cope with the crisis as such, but also address it in a way that we come out of it stronger and in a balanced and inclusive way.
Thank you, Fakir, for that optimistic note. Now, let me go to Vijay with a question to tap on his thoughts on the issue. Now, your company, Vijay, is one of the world's largest agricultural investors. With the projected rise in the world's population from 7.2 billion today to about 10 billion in 2050, food will be in great demand. Now, during this crisis, we saw that supply chains can be broken, and our food security became a real concern. How can business and investors prepare for food security? Tell us, because this is something that all the countries are grappling with.
So thank you for this opportunity to participate today. It's 4:30 in the morning here in California, so you can see I'm passionate about this topic. I mean, Naveen manages roughly about $1.1 trillion in assets, and a large part is in alternatives. So we go back to 2011 when Naveen participated with the UN to help develop, farmland PRIs. With the United Nations. As you mentioned, population is going to increase to 10 billion. But not only that, with the affluence, if everyone in Brazil, China, India just has a $1 increase in per capita income, the consumption is going to go up for protein, for food, for grains, etc. So what we've been doing is we consider ourselves to be stewards of the environment, and not only, and we recognize that we cannot increase land use at disproportionately. So it really means how do you deal with the existing land, whether it's using sustainable fertilizer, water conservation, and simultaneously our infrastructure group has been investing more on the supply chain side, whether it's on storage, cold storages, etc., so that individuals can be have the access to both protein and to grain in a sustainable manner. So we've seen that you can make money while doing good, and that's been our mantra for many years, and we continue to do that. So yes, absolutely, this is an important aspect of our $1 trillion investment. and a large part of that is in farmland and infrastructure.
Thank you. Dr. Ma Jun, China has made a remarkable recovery from the COVID pandemic. So far, so good. With the concern to create jobs and to restart the economy, is the priority on sustainability, which is part of your national agenda, still being kept in focus? And how will that be done?
Certainly, we've been debating a lot in the recent months on the topic of green recovery, and I think there's increasing consensus that the massive amount of fiscal stimulus money need to be spent more on green and low carbon projects. In the financial sector, including the banks, investors, they need to manage environmental and climate risks much better than before. In terms of the government action, we're actually seeing quite a few initiatives that's supporting green recovery. For example, the national government just announced a very large green fund with total size at about 88 billion RMB, and it's dedicated to green, which is managed by the former official of the Ministry of Finance, and they'll be investing a lot in the Yangtze River area. And another action is a lot of local governments are now planning for what they call new infrastructure projects, which included solar, wind, and electric vehicle charging stations and so on. All of these, I think, will help facilitate the energy transition. And within the financial sector, a couple of encouraging signs. For example, the new green bond catalog, which is now still a version for inviting comments. And this new version has removed clean code technology from the green bond catalog, which is one, I think, important step towards the enhanced recognition of climate change as a major challenge in the agenda. And also the regulators, including the Ministry of Environment and the securities regulator, are working on a new rule which will require all listed companies and all bond issuers to disclose environmental information on a mandatory basis, beginning from the end of this year. I think that's going to help a lot in improving the transparency of the green finance market.
Well, thank you. I'd like to continue on a green recovery. And Feike, I'm wondering if you could tell us about green jobs. I know Europe is talking a lot about that. Everyone talks about green jobs for recovery. Is it easy to create these jobs? And are they good jobs?
I think all economies need to prepare and make themselves future-proof. And that is decreasing their carbon emissions and doing that by developing technologies, developing business models which create prosperity and create jobs for the people. And that is what Europe also tries to do with the Green Deal, supported by a lot of CEOs of companies. Now, the first question is maybe, what is a green company? There are in the world at this moment 650 different matrices to define which company is sustainable and green, etc. And there are several initiatives to converge all those different matrices to a limited set of matrices, like we did with financial matrices, with IFRS, etc. And I think that is important to define what is a green company and how we can take care of that. And I think what companies should do is to take a more balanced view between the short term and the long term, between stakeholders and shareholders, between creating prosperity and creating prosperity for all, so jobs. And the jobs need a lot of reskilling also of people. So what I mentioned, that inequality is a concern. Inequality, I think, can only be solved by reskilling also people to the jobs of the future. And if we switch from one technology and take the coal mines in the middle of the United States, which are largely closed, I mean, we need to reskill those people in the new green jobs. If we only go from A to B and a more circular or more sustainable economy, but don't reskill our people, we leave our own people behind. And that is what we should not do. So yes, it's possible. Yes, it is needed. But don't forget that we need to reskill and take our people with us and make it inclusive and be a little bit more precise whether it's really a green company or not.
Thank you. Yes, we have green jobs and we have to reskill people for green jobs. And from what you say, I think there are prospects of having good jobs, whether it's in the transport industry, renewable energy, you can name them. Now, I'd like to go on the theme of green, recovery and green bonds. Vijay, I think we are seeing today that the governments of Germany and Sweden have both launched green bonds. The question is, will green bonds take off? Is an area you are familiar with. Do you see other countries following suit? And we just read that Brussels is thinking of introducing green bonds too in their COVID recovery package. So what are the prospects? And what about blue bonds as well?
Well, thank you for that question. So I believe that actually green bonds have already taken off. It's, let me share with you some statistics. Last year, the market for green bonds grew by over 40%. So you're seeing a large momentum. The first time green bond issuers were a total of 280 companies. First time. In 2019, there was more than 250 billion in green bonds issued. So, so far, the biggest issuers have been companies, but as you mentioned, we are seeing countries too. It's not only just Germany and Switzerland and the more developed countries, but we recently saw Chile in Latin America, Indonesia in Asia, and Nigeria in Africa issuing green bonds. So you're seeing that becoming more mainstream. This is a great source of capital for much needed sustainable growth. Of course, in the recent past, we are seeing social bonds outpace green bonds, but I think that will change. As far as blue bonds are concerned, we at Naveen were one of 3 investors in the first ever blue bond that was issued by the government of Seychelles. And this was to improve the livelihoods of sustainable fishing and tourism in that country. So yes, we are actually seeing a lot more issuers, and it's a little bit of a chicken and egg because you need issuers to come out so that investors can invest and vice versa. But you're seeing that from companies and from countries to improve their sustainable growth, as was discussed earlier.
So we are seeing resources being put out to help people, companies, countries reach out for a more sustainable future. Dr. Ma Jun, in China has come out ahead, quite ahead, in green finance. Tell us how that happened and to explain green finance to the audience.
The origin of green finance in China was a discussion of using what we call alternative instruments to deal with environmental issues such as pollution. Because for a long time, the environmental regulators try to fix the problem by regulation, penalties for pollution and so on. And also for a long time, the fiscal authority tried to invest in green projects and tax the brown activities. But we continue to see the worsening of air quality, water quality, and we continue to see the land contamination. So it forces us to consider what other things we can do. And finance sector, we found indeed it could play a major role. For example, if the banks are fully aware of the environmental consequences of their lending, then they can successfully reduce the pollution by stop lending to polluting projects, and they're fully aware of the environmental benefits arising from green projects, that can invest or lend a lot to clean energy, clean transportation, green building, and so on and so forth. So how to change the behavior of finances, such as banks, investors, became critical. So in 2016, China put in a system, what we call green financial system, that involved 4 elements. One is taxonomy. We clearly defined what is green and what is brown for the financial institutions. And we developed the disclosure requirements for them to disclose environmental benefits of the green projects. And also we put in some incentives such as subsidies, guarantees for green projects. And we began to develop a system or suite of financial products, including green lending, green bonds, green insurance, green funds, and so on. We took what we call a top-down approach, which is led really by the government regulator. And we found it's successful, especially in the developing country setting, as the capacity for the private sector remains relatively weak, while the government has much more convening power for putting together such a system.
Thank you. Now, I want to remind the audience that you can send in your questions to us, because I'm going to open up for your questions. So could you start sending your questions in? But meanwhile, let me go to Faike with my question. You know, with COVID, in the midst of this COVID, what are some of the key challenges faced by companies offering solutions in environmental sustainability, and which green sectors have been most affected, you think? You know,
Right.
Where do they put the attention? And conversely, do you see green businesses emerging during this period?
Well, thank you, Professor Chan. And as you saw in the answers of Dr. Mai Jun and also Vijay Advani, we all three see great opportunities on greening our economy, and that can create prosperity and jobs. But I need to say honestly that many businesses are confronted also with the short-term challenges. And that is how to deal with the health of their own employees, how to deal with the whole supply chain, both their suppliers and their customers, how to deal with a different way of working on distance from home. Not all people can do that, obviously, but how do we manage that? Some businesses with drastic changes in their business, like online shopping or retail or hospitality or airlines or supply to airlines or catering or hospitality or whatever business. So I think that is at this moment in the mind of many companies. But since companies need to balance the short and the long term, there is also a life after COVID. And the question is, how would that world look like? And that world would maybe look different in terms of online, offline. That would look different in terms of traveling. That looks different in terms of how to engage in your work. That look different in terms of how to address a potential next pandemic, climate change. Where, let's be honest, countries like Ethiopia, Bangladesh, are already confronted today with the negative and the adverse effects of climate change. They cannot grow their own food and their own crops today due to climate change. And it is our obligation also as a kind of Marshall Plan-like approach to help those countries. And for the companies involved, there are great opportunities of contributing to this new world. Once again, in investing in certain green technologies. And it is globally different. In some areas, wind energy will work better. In some areas, solar energy will work better. Sometimes hydrogen will work better. Working on batteries will help, all of the above, etc., etc. To make agriculture, like Vijay was also saying, to make agriculture more resilient towards climate change will serve many of those. So those are the opportunities, and companies are dealing that, need to deal with that. But let's be honest, Professor Chan, also in the context that many companies look also to the short term as well, and how
Yes.
to deal with the current adverse situation.
Thank you. Thank you, Faike. Now, we have two questions, and one, I think, naturally goes to Vijay. So this is posed by Stephen Miller, and he asks, could you please define blue bonds?
Yeah, I think very similar to green bonds or social bonds. What countries are doing right now is, as I mentioned about Seychelles, uh, that are predominantly dependent on fishery or tourism. So blue stands for water, and we're trying to see that if you can ring fence the monies that are raised by blue bonds to continue to develop, whether it's water purification, whether it's fisheries, whether it is helping build sustainable coastlines or tourism, water tourism. So it's really countries that are highly dependent on water or the sea for their development, and that's what really blue bonds are.
Yeah, thank you. I was going to ask Dr. Martin to pick up from what Faike spoke about, green technologies, and that, there are countries like in Africa, Ethiopia, you can name Somalia, some of these countries, which really are so badly hit by climate change that, they are struggling to really grow food, make a living, find water, etc. So what advice would you have for emerging economies who have to struggle with finding resources, dealing with competing priorities, and funding between health and sustainability?
I think for very low-income countries which are hit very hard by COVID, the international community indeed has the obligation to help them. And a lot of international organizations, MDBs, are working on these projects, and also a lot of bilateral assistance are being arranged. I think the issue is how to make sure that the assistance helping them economic recovery, job recovery at the same time, making sure that these projects are also environmentally sustainable and creating as much green jobs as possible. But for these countries themselves, I think the domestic capacity building is also very important. We actually provided some capacity building services for emerging market economy in the past couple of years in the area of green finance. And we thought actually there are many low cost or low hanging fruits that we can provide to these countries in building up their green finance basis, for example, helping them on green taxonomy. In fact, it wasn't very difficult. In our experience in helping one of the emerging markets, we sent a couple of delegations in a matter of 6 months, and that country were able to issue the green taxonomy for the uses by financial institutions and financial markets.
Thank you. Now, the questions are coming in fast and furious. So let me just read. There was a very patient questioner who asked initially, studies have shown that ESG assets tend to perform better than non-ESG assets on financial markets. Do you see this reducing the hesitancy that the business world has shown towards sustainability? This is for all the three panelists. You can have a say.
Yeah, if I
Yeah?
Vijay,
Yes,
you
Faike?
first. Vijay knows
Okay.
all about the bonds and the investors. Vijay
Yes,
first.
No,
please.
well, thank you. So I think, firstly, before I answer that, it's not ironic that exactly today is the 15th of September. On the 13th of September, 1970, the eminent global economist, Nobel laureate Milton Friedman had said, businesses' only responsibility is to generate profits for its shareholders. We've come a long way in the last 50 years. So sustainable growth, I'll hazard a guess and tell you, 10, 15 years from now, even the term ESG will disappear. Because how can an analyst not who's analyzing an oil company or a car company not look at governance and the environment before buying that stock? So today, yes, it's part of ESG, but I think it's going to become mainstream, because I don't think you can buy a large publicly traded oil company without looking at the environment, the impact that it does on environment, or a company that has, you know, child labor or no women on the board, or diversity as far as governance is concerned. So I think this sustainability ESG is a journey, not a destination, and it's here to stay.
Anyone else?
Yeah, I agree with Vijay's remarks. I mean, 15 years ago, also when I started as a CEO, I said I would like to run our company in a more successful way and contribute to a better world in terms of environmental and social. And many of the analysts 15 years ago asked, what is it? Creating a better world and contributing to climate and social issues, or run your company successful? And I said both. And they said, it's maybe either or. Today, we have proven that it does not have to be either or, and that they can go hand in hand. Not always, but they can go hand in hand, well, if well managed, and then they even perform better. And I agree with Vijay, if we fast forward another 15 years, they will go, they must go hand in hand together. To be totally blind for social issues, to be totally blind for environmental issues will not help your value of your assets. It will not be what society wants from you. It will not be what your employees ask from you. It will not be what investors ask from you. And look, a lot of investors are pension funds. They have a 30 years horizon. So they have to look through the different cycles, and they have to look whether you contribute to a better world and be a little bit a purpose-led organization, contribute to society and environmental. And if not, you will lose your license to operate, you will lose the value of your assets, and your investors will not like it.
Right. Now I have another question here. Oh my, there's so many questions. Oh, sorry, Marjun, you would like to say something?
Can I just add a few words on that ESG topic? Although the concept was developed from OECD countries back many years ago, but I think its usage in developing countries is even bigger. For example, my research center at Tsinghua University has done a back testing showing that the ESG portfolio in the stock market could outperform the main index by 6 percentage points per year for the past 6 years. So it's a very significant value coming out of the ESG investing practice, largely because by focusing on ESG better performers, you are actually excluding those companies which will likely blow up in the form of, involving environmental incidents or financial frauds and so on and so forth. By excluding these companies, the remainder of the portfolio is certainly going to do better.
Right. Now I have the next question from Chi Xiang from a journal, The Edge. The question: in light of the urgency of climate change, should countries move to introduce introduce a more active industrial policy in the area of building up sustainable industries? Any takers?
Yeah, I think that countries should be careful that they can choose the right industrial sectors and that they can make the economy as it should be. Normally, countries are not excellent in doing that. What they can do is set the conditions in which some countries, industries can flourish, and they can invest and build the competencies needed. So if I look to competencies, artificial intelligence or robotization or green technologies will be important to invest in as competencies. If you look to sectors, I will be a little bit careful. But if you look to setting the circumstances, for example, putting a price on carbon, And companies cannot do that, internally, but the external price on carbon can only be created by countries. And of course, by putting a price on carbon, they create circumstances in which low emission industries will flourish better, or industries which have a lot of emissions will try to reduce it in order to benefit themselves. So I would say setting the conditions and investing in competences, and don't think that governments can totally shape and make exactly the industrial sectors which will flourish.
Yeah, I'm not sure if we want to use the word industrial policy in this setting, because sometimes industrial policies are regarded as a sort of artificial government intervention and distorting, market pricing, or lifting competitiveness, against the foreign competitors and so on. I would prefer to use the word of correcting externality, because a lot of green projects, they do have positive externality in the form of reducing pollutions and reducing carbon emissions, but the market pricing itself does not help them internalize these externality, and that's why companies tend to underinvest in green sectors, and that's why the government needs to do something to overcome that inability to internalize externality. So in our country, what we did in the finance space included the subsidies for green lending by local governments, and also government provision of guarantees for green projects. And also at the central bank level, we're able to provide what we call green relending facility, which is low cost funding for green projects through the commercial banks. And these indeed helped speed up the growth of green lending and green activities.
Thank you. Now we have time for maybe one or two questions. Here's a zinger. Do the panelists believe all listed companies' CEOs and management's pay should be linked to the metric on lowering greenhouse gas emissions in addition to other financial metrics? Rajiv K. Thank you, Rajiv, for the question.
No, let me address it right away. We started in our company already 8 years ago with that, to have a narrative that you care about social and environmental issues, and have your executive pay only based on short-term or financial metrics is weird. So I would say a full yes, it should be.
Anyone
Yes,
else?
and I think I'll just add to this. I think it's a little nuanced answer, because I think disclosure and measurement are going to be important. I mean, executives disclose financials, they are measured based on financials. So it's the key part. It's not so much about the environment, but anything that you claim you're doing should be disclosed and measured. And as long as you can do both of those, automatically your success and your pay gets measured based on metrics, which has been going on for hundreds of years. So it's all about disclosure and measurement.
Does Martin want the word?
I just want to echo Vijay that the disclosure of environmental climate information by companies are very important. If you disclose better performance in the green space, the share price will go up, and the senior managers will be rewarded automatically. Otherwise, if you are not disclosing, or you are disclosing performance which is deteriorating in the green space, you'll be penalized by the market.
Thank you.
If I may, Professor Chan, I would like to build on what Vijay said earlier. See how much the world has been changed. Dr. Ma, Vijay, myself have been growing up with an economist, and Vijay mentioned Milton Friedman, who said, focus on shareholder value. We have been growing up with a CEO of GE, which said only shareholders value. I mean, that was our circumstances in terms of CEOs, in terms of economists, when we were starting our career, and see how the world has been changed since then.
Right, and that's very positive, Afike. Now, I will give the last question to Audrey Tan from Straits Times. She's asked this question long ago, and it has to do with the looming impact of climate change And she says that actually there is a lot of emphasis on green recovery, but the rate of return on some of these green technology, energy technologies is still far off, and especially around green hydrogen and carbon capture technologies. So do you think this will affect the willingness of governments to invest more heavily in these efforts that can create green jobs?
I mean, I'm happy to take a shot at this. I think I disagree. I think there is returns and doing good for society and the environment can coexist. And again, yes, there are a lot of greenwashing right now. People are talking about green, but not necessarily doing it. I think, as I mentioned earlier, it's a journey, not a destination. So my only comment, I'm optimistic that the more disclosure and more measurement that there is, you'll see society embrace this. There's over $30 trillion that are going to be inherited by millennials over the next several decades. They generally want to vote for, societal good. So you're going to see more and more of this, and I think they do coexist. I mean, returns and doing good for society can coexist.
Thank you,
Let me
Vijay.
add that
Yes,
some
yes,
green
Martin.
projects would deliver financial returns only in the medium and longer term. So we need some patience for some investors, and that's why a financial market with a different type of investors are very important. Some investors, lenders may be willing to invest in lending only for 1 or 2 years. Others may be willing to do 7 to 10 years. And these are the PEs and VCs and some of the other government investors. They need to play their role.
Thank you, Ma Jun. And on that note, I think I'm going to close this discussion. There are more questions coming. So clearly our panelists have done their job. They've stimulated the audience in the discussion. And I would like to thank the audience for their keen attention and these very good questions. There are so many of them, and I do not have the time to read all of them. So thank you very much, and good night.